This was the only decisive game of the Superbet Chess Classic Round 1. So this is a Grand Chess Tour event. It's being played in Bucharest, Romania. I'm covering all of the Alireza Firouzja games. I covered his game against Fabi if you want to check that one out. And I'm hoping to post his round 2 game this evening on the day it's played. I'm quite busy today though, so I don't know if I'll get to it this evening. If not, it'll be first thing tomorrow. So in the meantime, I'm also looking at this Wesley So versus Shak Mamedyarov game. This was played yesterday in round 1. Really interesting game and decisive result. So let's see what happened here. Wesley kicked off with d4. Shak went knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, and after knight c3, Shak goes bishop b4. Now we're in a Nimzo Indian. Now many different ways to play here, of course. Wesley goes e3, the so-called Rubinstein variation. Black castles here, lots of different moves. Don't want to go too deep on all the opening nuances. Bishop to d3 from Wesley, pawn d5, strikes a claim in the centre, and now Wesley captures that one, the pawn recaptures, and he goes pawn to a3 here, putting a question to the bishop. So you can give up for knight, gain more control of e4, but instead Shak decides to retreat that bishop, keep his bishop pair, and this is actually exactly how Wesley played against Sam Sevian just last week in the American Cup. But he was saying, interestingly, that he didn't think Shak had seen that game yet because it wasn't yet in the master database, so he probably hadn't seen what happened. So queen c2 from Wesley, standard development, and now Sam Sevian went pawn c6, and we got a really wild game where Wesley castled queenside. He tried to get a kingside attack. He actually went on to lose it, but Sevian then went c5 at a later point, so he did this move in 2 goes. Now what Shak does here is pawn a6, so he takes control of the b5 square. He also wants c5 at a later point if possible, liberating his pieces and position. And knight g to e2 now from Wesley. So once again we see this knight coming to e2. This has actually been the theme of the last 3 games I've covered on the channel. So it's a very flexible square. It can come into f4 from there, attack the d5 pawn. So now rook e8 from Shak, castles from Wesley, and pawn b6. So supporting that c5 break, the bishop's often coming to b7, and that's why Wesley goes b4. He clamps on that breaking move. Knight b to d7 was played developing, and now an interesting idea from Wesley, he goes knight f4 here. So he's pressuring that d5 pawn, offering that knight to the black bishop if black wants it. Now the most natural move on the board here is just to go bishop to b7, defending the pawn, and this would have been best actually. And what white just has to be careful of here now, one thing I want to show you, is that if you get too casual, say you go bishop to b2 or something, well now black's breaking with c5, getting a good game. So actually in this position here, you'd have to go rook to b1. Okay, game goes on. Black can't yet go c5, but they can wait with all sorts of moves, h6, rook c8, c6 even, etc. So this is how the game could have gone. But what Shak did here was a very committal move. He chopped off that knight on f4, the pawn recaptured, and this is strategically dangerous because he's now given up that dark squared bishop. And although he goes c5, this is his whole idea. He liberates the backwards pawn. That's why he does this. After this pawn is captured, then this bishop could turn into a monster. But I just want to pause here. What do you think the best way to capture that pawn is? Do you go with b pawn or d pawn? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already to never miss a future game. So the best way to capture here is d takes on c5, and that's what Wesley did. For the simple positional reason that now look at that wonderful diagonal that you've opened up for your bishop. So the pawn recaptured here, and now Wesley brought the rook to the centre. He leaves these pawns for the moment, leaves that tension to be resolved. We can see that it's not so easy for black to now develop harmoniously. So Shak goes bishop to b7, and now you could actually take on c5 immediately here as white. That was probably the most accurate, but what Wesley played, knight to a4, was also a good move. Now there's tons of pressure here, it's impossible to cope with without playing pawn to c4. So that's what was played, but now look at these dark squares. This could get dangerous if black's not careful. So the bishop came to f5 here, pressures against the knight, very annoying on that square. Do you want to go g6? Well, you can do, but then you weaken more dark squares. And the best way for Shak to play here was actually with queen c7. So you eye the f4 pawn. Now white never wants to go pawn g6, g3 rather, or then you're opening these light squares. d4 at the right moment could be very dangerous with the queen landing on c6. So you'd go say something like bishop e3, we saw this in the game as well, and then knight f8 is a really interesting computer line. Now it's not so human to play like this because when the knight leaves this square and comes back, you leave c5. So now white could hop in here, for example, but then the computer just calmly goes bishop c8, exchanging those light squared bishops and says, okay, what's the big deal? How are you breaking through? It gives 0, 0, 0. But okay, this is not such a human way to play. It's hard to find this whole concept, letting the knight into c5. So Shak didn't go queen c7. He went pawn a5, breaking at those queenside pawns. Now bishop e3 anyway. There was an exchange on b4 and he put the queen on e7, attacking that b4 pawn. The rook defended here, and now Shak just didn't want to keep living with that bishop on f5, so he kicks it with g6. But Wesley just chopped on d7, the knight recaptured, and we can really start to see the long-term positional issues for black here. You've got this passed pawn, your own pawns in the centre are stymied by the white pieces, you've got this monster bishop coming to diagonal, the knight looks better, really tough now for Shak. So knight c3 was played, hits that pawn, knight f6 defended, and now the most accurate here actually was to play pawn h3. Because Shak wants to go knight h5 here, but you can't do it yet because then you lose on d5. So black would have to wait, would say queen e6, and white's gained a tempo. But what Wesley did was bishop d4, still a good move, but now black can go knight h5 because you blocked this rook from the attack of the pawn. So the pawn's attacked here, queen d2 defended it, and now Shak really had to play this queen h4 move, just going for counterplay, pressuring that pawn. You force g3, but then queen h3, and okay, we can see there could start to be some counterplay ideas here. The knight can come to g7 and f5 potentially. Do you want to give this bishop? That was best. But Shak didn't do this, he was a bit off form, he went pawn f6 instead, but this is pretty passive now. So h3 from Wesley, the knight came back to g7, looking into f5, so bishop c5 preempted that, the queen came to f7, and now knight b5, looking at that d6 square menacingly. So knight f5 defended, and now I know you're instantly thinking, well, that surely doesn't work. Pawn g4, that knight's loose, it has to go away. But if you do this, you're instantly losing the game, and this is the importance of tactics, of course, to marry up with the positional understanding. So if you go g4, you're just busted to this d4 move. The key reason being that now the queen is coming to d5. So if you capture, queen d5, look at that king, it's Swiss cheese around the king, as Hikari would say. You have to go f3, queen takes, queen h2 defends, but then there's this beautiful rook a2 move. Hits the second rank, decoys the queen, it's just completely game over. It's mate in 4 or 3, depending how white plays. So that's why you can't go g4, kicking that knight. Wesley just goes knight to d4 here, and now queen d7 was played, defends this knight here, the rook came to e1, challenges the e-file, king f7 added some defense, slightly improved the king, we had an exchange here, the rook recaptured, rook a1 now played, looking to invade, but rook a8 challenged that one. It came to the e-file now, and ultimately Wesley's happy to exchange rooks here because his long-term advantages of the better minor pieces, better bishops, just persist in this position. So rook e8 challenged, and now Wesley chops off, the queen recaptured here, and actually Shak gets these double pawns on f5 now. He did have an option to take on d4 first, but even after doing that, white would still have options of pawn f5 and that kind of thing. So white would have retained advantage even without these double pawns. So pressure on Shak now to try and hold the draw. It's opposite coloured bishops, notoriously drawish, but white just has a complete bind on the position here. So bishop d4 was played, and now you could try and invade with the queen to queen e4. The guys in the studio, Yasser Serwan, Peter Svidler, they looked at this, but really you're not actually getting anywhere because white can always wiggle away with queen b2 or queen a1, look to invade here. So instead Shak just goes bishop c6, staying on the position. Pawn f3 now stops any queen invasion to e4. We had pawn h5, there's not so many moves for black. This one clamps against g4, and now Yasser just wanted to play king h2 here, also a good move, get that king nice and safe, snug as a bug in a rug. But what Wesley does was queen to f2 here, and this was a nice move in time pressure, Peter Svidler pointed out, because you asked black a few more tricky questions. You know, you're coming in here now, then looking at f6, h5, so that's why queen f8 was played, preparing to meet those threats. And now queen b2 switched back, targets f6, and Shak should have gone king g6 there, opening up the queen's defense. Instead he went queen to b8, targeting f4, looking for some kind of counterplay stuff, but this was actually a mistake. Wesley should have taken on f6 here, and I don't want to go too deep on all the details, but that would have been good for white. You eliminate this pawn, then the queen and bishop can start having fun on this diagonal. Maybe you invade here. That was good for white. But we didn't have that captures. Wesley went queen d2 instead. He's just sitting on the position, so king g6 played, queen e3 looks to invade, king f7 comes back, bishop c3 holds that b pawn once again. The bishop came to d7, king h2, and really all Shak can do is shuffle. So he goes queen d6 here, and the king started marching in. It's actually heading for this h4 square to pressure the pawns, and it's actually perfectly safe there. We'll see in a moment that Wesley even puts this pawn onto g3 here, and the king looks a bit entombed, but actually you can't get to it as black. If you ever try to bring the queen around, then your own f6 pawn will be weak. So g3 now played, bishop e8, queen b2, and now here queen c6 was played, looking to actually come out to a4, but it's just the wrong idea from Shak, because after queen to a3, looking to invade, here Shak should just wait on the position and play king f7. He goes queen to a4, but this is a decisive blunder, because now Wesley switches back, queen e3, leaving the b pawn, looking to invade on e7. You can't take here as black, or you lose your bishop, of course. So Shak had to dive back and defend like this, but then pawn b5. This is the critical thing. You create threats on both sides of the board. Shak actually captured that one. There wasn't so much else to do. It was a very tough position, but this is just a decisive blunder. He even resigned this position whilst Wesley was still away from the board, because now you can go queen e6 and you're just decisively invading. You're hitting this f6 pawn, but you're also threatening to go here. So there's really no move. Say you go queen c6. I just want to show the checkmate here because it's quite nice using the pawns. So king h6 would be played, and now pawn g4. This is the problem. You're threatening g5 mating, using the king that marched up the board. So just to show the final lines, something like this, and now the pawn comes to g5. This is mate, really beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed this game. If you've missed my Alireza one, then click here, and see another Wesley one, click below that. Thanks for watching, see you soon.